Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Revising, Editing, and Proofreading Long Documents workshop. Joining us today is Tim Buchanan from the Writing Center. I'm going to hand it over to Tim to get us started.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. My name is Tim. I'm one of the coordinators at the UNLV Writing Center. And yeah, I think we can just go ahead and get started. Let me share my screen here for the presentation. I don't think I've used WebEx since the last time I gave this presentation. So everybody can see my screen okay?
Yes.
Excellent. All right, great. This is our strategies for revising, editing, and proofreading long documents. In this workshop, I'm going to talk a bit about how we define strategies for revising, editing, and proofreading, and discuss some of those strategies in a little bit more detail. We're going to identify the goals of revising, editing, and proofreading, and also review examples of some of these skills. So just as an overview, let me move this window. Revising, editing, and proofreading are all of the considerations that we make after the principal or initial phase of writing is done. That means that at this point in time, we've completed our rough draft of our project, and we're now looking to ways to refine and finalize all of the things that we've done. Revising and editing are recursive processes, by which we mean these are things that we go back to over and over. It's not necessarily a strict linear process where we like, I have revised, I have edited, and then I'm done. Likely these are things that you will do even as you write the rough draft in some pieces. The writing process is really what you make it, but revising and editing have very specific operations that we'll talk about. However, proofreading is the very final step in the writing process. It's something that we advise you save for the very end, the very last thing you do before you turn in that project or before you finalize your writing in total. There we go. So what's the difference between these three processes? Revising considers the entire paper, the paper as a whole product, and is largely concerned with all of the content therein. Editing focuses in on sentence level issues and is largely concerned with fine-tuning the clarity, how well those larger ideas are coming across. Proofreading considers the presentation of the overall project, the overall product. And is largely concerned with those fine granular details like spelling, punctuation, and so on. So first we're going to talk about revising. Revising focuses on the overall purpose of your document, what it is your writing is trying to do. It looks at the organization of your paper, how things are structured both in the whole and within individual paragraphs, and how all of these things flow together. It pays special attention to things like your introduction and your conclusion, and also the order of individual body paragraphs. It takes a closer look at your thesis statement to make sure that it's doing everything that it needs to be doing. And then in paragraphs, those topic sentences that introduce the ideas that you're going to describe in each body paragraph. It looks out for the key ideas and definitions of your paper to see how those things are making connections between ideas effectively, and your use of evidence to support the various claims that you are making. This process may involve adding new material, moving around existing material so that it makes more sense, or so that it flows in a more coherent manner, removing non-essential materials, or elaborating on ideas that maybe need a little bit more detail to make their point, and narrowing your focus of topics from, say, something more general to something more specific, a little bit more incisive. So some goals for revision. In the introduction, you want to make sure that you're offering useful background and context for your reader. This might include the historical context of your topic. It might include the major stakeholders in the issue that you are talking about. It gives some idea of what the content of your paper is going to involve. Your introduction should somehow indicate your paper's overall purpose and create a kind of roadmap for your reader. What we mean by roadmap in this case is that the way you structure your introduction is going to, in some way, encapsulate the larger ideas that your paper is going to discuss. And the order in which you describe those or discuss those or introduce those in your introduction creates a sort of unconscious structure. At the same time that you're telling your reader what your paper is going to include, you're also kind of telling them the order in which those concepts are going to appear. And this is what we mean by a roadmap for your reader. The body paragraphs should build from clear, straightforward sentences. These sentences should occur around the first sentence of each paragraph and give the reader a strong idea of what topic that paragraph is going to discuss. We want to check the transitions between paragraphs to make sure that our last sentence leads cleanly into the first sentence of the next. And each one of these paragraphs should relate meaningfully to your purpose and thesis statement. If you have a paragraph that doesn't contribute to or elucidate that thesis statement in some way, that's a good indication that maybe it doesn't belong, or maybe it needs to be retooled in some way to make it fit. And then when we look at conclusions, we see your conclusion should look to the future in some way. By future, we mean beyond the topic that you're writing about in your paper. How does it sort of further discussion or look to ways that maybe more conversation about this topic can be generated from the paper that the reader just read? Some of the ways we do this are by making some sort of call to action, what a reader should do or could do in light of all of the information they've just gained. It also might invite further thought or study into the topic. In essence, the conclusion should tell the reader something about why the paper they just read was important. So some useful questions that you can ask yourself through the revision process might include, how well does this paper convey my overall purpose? Is it doing its job, essentially? Do I provide enough context for my audience? Does my audience have all the information that they need to know in order to get started on the paper they're about to read? And does my intro establish a problem or knowledge gap that I am then going to fill or elucidate in some way through the body of my paper? Am I missing any necessary definitions? Is there anything in there that needs clarifying for the reader? Does my thesis make a strong, clear claim? The thesis is essentially the backbone of the paper. It is the through line that runs from the introduction to the conclusion. And so there needs to be a claim that can be reasoned through and argued throughout the paper. Does each section help support my thesis? Does each contribute to my purpose in a meaningful way? Or do I need to elaborate on any of these ideas to make them fit? In the revision process, it's never a bad idea to look at each paragraph one at a time and kind of measure it against that thesis that you created and ask yourself whether or not these things are working together. Some more questions. Can a reader easily follow my organization? Am I following the structure that I provided in my roadmap? Am I describing those topics in the same order that I introduced them? Does the last sentence of each body paragraph lead into the following topic sentence? Am I developing my ideas thoroughly? Do any sections feel out of place? Would they work better earlier or later in my paper? does my conclusion look to the future? Does it call to action or invite further thought or study on the topic I just discussed? Some of the strategies that you might employ while you're revising are things like reading out loud. I can't stress this enough. This is one of our hallmark strategies in the Writing Center. But by reading out loud, we tend to find the little mistakes that that we didn't catch in earlier revision processes or as we were writing. We can feel ourselves tripping up because we're not quite that division of tasks between like seeing a sentence on the page and then reading it out loud kind of skips past that sort of automatic editing that we have when we're typing, and we know the ideas in our head and we think we're putting them down, but they come out a little garbled. So reading out loud will kind of help break or kind of create a barrier where we're not automatically editing while we're writing. You might try reading only the topic sentences of each of your paragraphs. This will tell you whether or not your paper is skim friendly. And if you can get the gist of your paper, the ideas that you're trying to discuss, by reading just the topic sentences in their order, you can reasonably you can be reasonably sure that your order of ideas is making logical sense. Very, very important, I think, is to get help from a second pair of eyes. This could be a friend or a colleague. This could be a mentor, somebody else in your field. Very obviously, this could be the Writing Center. This is exactly our purpose and who we are and what we do. We exist as a second pair of eyes, or third or fourth pair of eyes, depending on how many times you want to come to us, to get that outside perspective on your writing. It's a good time to ask whether or not the key ideas make sense to another person. It'll be very important for you to save whatever you remove from your paper in a separate file. If you're cutting things from your paper through the revision process, keep a separate file, just miscellaneous removed items file. I keep this for every single thing that I write, because you never know when you might cut something very useful that you might later find actually does belong in this paper, just in another place, or might spark an idea for some future writing. Another thing some people do is physically cut apart and reorganize the draft of their paper. This usually includes cutting whole paragraphs so that they can kind of be moved around like puzzle pieces. I know some people who do this, they'll cut them up and they'll just lay everything out on like a hardwood floor or something and just kind of move things around. They'll put them in strange orders to see if they make sense, just to kind of see what comes up. And these are just some strategies for revising, but through the Writing Center, we can talk about all sorts of different strategies for working through this process. Let's see, should we or not? Oh, I can't really see the chat easily. Let me see if I can get that up somehow.
I can read it out for you. It says, should we or not include citations of the abstract?
Citations in the abstract. You know, I'm not super clear on that, to be perfectly honest. I know that before we started this, Sarah shared our Writing Center resources page with us. And in that resources page, we have a lot of different handouts and workshops that talk about these specific, more granular issues in detail. We do have a handout on writing abstracts. So I'm sorry I don't have like an immediate answer for you. My gut reaction is to say no, that you don't include those citations, but don't take my word for that. I would go check out the our Writing Center handout on creating abstracts and see what that has to say. Yes, thank you so much. And I'll have a link to the to our Writing Center website at the end here. Okay, so let's move on to talk about editing. Editing focuses largely on the precision of each sentence and word in a sentence. It's very concerned with the clarity of ideas. Through sentence structure and variety, paragraph structure and variety, we try to promote that sense of clarity to ensure that our ideas are coming across as we intended them. This also includes focusing on attribution or giving credit to the sources of information that we use as evidence to support our own claims. We look to using borrowed information responsibly. Typically, this includes paraphrasing over direct quotations, making sure that in as many cases as humanly possible, we are putting these ideas in our own words, synthesizing them through our own thought processes. It also focuses on the uses of headings, style and tone, and inclusivity, in terms of whatever writing style we're employing for our academic writing, whether it be MLA, APA, Chicago style, and the countless others that exist out there. This phase of the process may involve choosing more specific words in place of vague words, reorganizing phrases or wordings in sentences to allow our ideas to come through more clearly, reducing instances of repetition when that repetition is unnecessary or confusing, limiting the use of jargon, not necessarily eliminating it completely, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a moment, and changing direct quotes to paraphrases or summaries to maintain the integrity of our own thought processes over just parroting other people's ideas. So some editing goals are to break up lengthy sentences and paragraphs, things that are stretching over long, so that we give the reader a little break in order for them to be able to absorb the ideas we just shared. One of the things I see in the Writing Center a lot are very long paragraphs, paragraphs that extend for pages. So just one quick note on paragraphs. When you find that the topic of a paragraph shifts slightly, even if it's still talking about the same idea, but is maybe focusing on a different facet of that idea, it's a good indication of a place where you want to break that paragraph up. Part of the reason paragraph breaks exist is because in papers, especially in academic writing, we're giving so much information at a time that we want to allow the reader a little pause, just that tiniest microsecond of a mental break in order to absorb the information that we've just imparted so that they feel ready to move on to the next. We, of course, want to reduce jargon where we can, where it's useful to do. We want to cut down on overly wordy passages or sentences. We want to swap out vague words, things like very and thing, which could mean almost anything, signify almost any object or idea under the sun, for more specific terms. We also want to be reducing passive voice wherever possible and concentrating on active voice sentences. We want to check our adjectives and adverbs first to make sure that they are adequately describing what we're meaning, and also whether or not they're necessary at all. Sometimes adjectives can exist as, adjectives and adverbs can exist as filler words that are just sort of taking up space. And in that taking up space, they may be creating more confusion than clarity. We also use this part of the process to ensure the accuracy of the information or data that we're imparting through our writing, and creating a scholarly and inclusive tone in our writing. So some questions to ask during the editing process. Does each sentence make sense on its own? Does each sentence make sense in the larger context of the paper? Are my word choices specific enough? Are my sentences concise, or do they go on too long? Do I use summary and paraphrase more often than direct quotations? Do I credit my sources? And is my tone respectful and inclusive? So some strategies for editing, of course, once again, read out loud. I can't stress this enough, as many times as I'm going to stress it in this presentation. If you're nervous about reading out loud, try to find a quiet, empty space. Shut yourself in your room. Maybe go sit in your car. But it is such an important part of the process. You will be amazed what you'll find when you try this strategy. Also, make a checklist of your concerns, even before you start the editing process. We all have ideas of where our shortcomings lie. Oftentimes we're wrong, but of course, largely we're right about what we might not be doing well, or what we fear we might not be doing well. So make a list of those individual concerns. And then for each one of those concerns, read through your paper just looking for instances of that thing. And as you're reading through, look for the patterns of mistakes you make. What is your particular error vice? Do you overuse commas? Is there a particular word that you seem to go to all the time? And check for inconsistencies. Sarah has talked about things like parallel structure, but also in the ways that you phrase things. Depending on your discipline, depending on what you're writing, there may be a particular way that you phrase a concept or idea. And it may feel repetitious to keep phrasing it that way, but when you change up the phrasing of a core concept from your paper, just for the sake of not being repetitious, you run the risk of creating an inconsistency that might confuse your reader if they think you're talking about one thing and are suddenly switching to talk about another. So be aware of how those inconsistencies might affect the reader's reception of your writing. Also, cut the non-essentials. If a passage sounds nice but doesn't add any actual value, if it's not contributing in some way to the thesis statement, then remove it. It may hurt, but I promise you it's a valuable part of the process. And always keep your audience in mind. Think about what your audience knows or doesn't know. Write to their knowledge base, but also be aware of where you can fill in the knowledge gaps. That's essentially what any paper is meaning to do, is filling in knowledge gaps. So be aware of what your audience may or may not know. Of course, this may come as a shock to you, but I'm going to suggest that you also get help from a second pair of eyes. The reason I put this on multiple slides is not just to say, not just to reinforce really hard, like, please come to the writing center, please show your writing to other people, but that in each one of these phases, in so much as they are separate processes, you might come to the writing center or seek out a friend or colleague, at the stage of revision, and then again at the stage of editing, to get specific feedback on how those different processes are working. And of course, this is a great time to ask that person whether or not your language is clear and easily understood. For people writing in, say, non-academic English fields, more technical fields, a lot of the Writing Center staff doesn't necessarily have expertise in these fields, but we are more than capable and qualified to talk about the writing itself, the language you're using, and talking to someone who isn't an expert in your field may be a great way to get an idea of how clear your writing is. If you're writing in a very technical or scientific field, and that person doesn't have that background but still understands what you're writing about, still understands the topic in question, then you have done your job well. So in terms of sentence structure, STEM and humanity fields look at things a little differently. The STEM field prefers short declarative sentences that gets to their point quickly. Of course, active voice is preferred almost exclusively to passive voice. A clear attribution of sources is absolutely necessary, as well as a consistent use of language and form. Form largely meaning things like citation style, use of headings, page numbers, font styles and sizes, etc. The humanities are a little more open with their sentences in that they accept both declarative and interrogative sentences, both statements and questions. Sometimes questions can be asked in a paper as a way to transition to the larger point, or to sort of open the topic to areas of interrogation. The humanities still prefer active voice to passive voice, though there are more instances of passive voice in humanities sentences. Clear attribution still is a must, but you'll find that the humanities look for an artful variation in sentence lengths. Rather than preferring short declarative sentences, they like sentences to move back and forth between short to medium length, long, in a sort of unconscious flow. The paragraph structure, however, is largely agreed on between the two disciplines. Specific topic sentences begin the paragraph to give a clear idea of what is contained or what ideas are going to be discussed within that paragraph. Each paragraph should have a clear purpose that relates back to the thesis, and transitional phrases between sentences and paragraphs help move things along. I'm gonna pause for a quick drink of water. And I believe you were talking about transitions in the last workshop, so I'm not going to say a whole lot about them, except in a very broad sense. My advice here is to not overuse transitional phrases, things like although or however. Use those judiciously. Oftentimes, ideas that follow logically, this idea leads to this idea, may transition naturally without the help of a transitional phrase. But double check this with yourself, against yourself or a second reader, to make sure that these paragraphs, these sentences, do flow from one to the next. Remember that transitional phrases exist to aid the move from one idea to another. So the larger the logical leap between two ideas, the more necessary the transitional phrase may be. In terms of clarity, sentences rely on precision to get their ideas across, and that precision comes from specificity and conciseness. So as you're going through your papers in the editing phase, examine the use of vague words like it, they, them, things, stuff. Ask yourself, will the reader know from the context of the sentence or the paragraph what these words refer to, what they signify? If ever you're in doubt, be specific. Just name the thing. What is it? Who are they? Every word in a sentence should do work. By this we mean it should be somehow meaningfully contributing to the sentence and thereby the paragraph. If it's not doing work, then it's not essential. And we cut non-essential or overly wordy writing. Ask yourself, can I say this more simply? Is there some way that I can combine terms to make this a bit more concise? So some strategies for reducing wordiness is to eliminate placeholders. And this kind of gets at what I was saying a second ago about combining things. In the example we have, there are many causes of poverty. They include. Well, we don't need that sort of introductory placeholder to say there are many causes of poverty. We can shorten that, kind of combining these two ideas to say the many causes of poverty include, and then whatever it is we're going to talk about. You might also eliminate things like nominalizations. That's when we take a verb and turn it into a noun. So as in the example, the bigot caused the introduction of anger into the situation. The word introduced has been turned into the noun introduction. So we can just simplify this by saying the bigot introduced anger into the situation. You might also swap out lengthy phrases for single words. You know, it sounds fancy to say due to the fact that, but really we can just say because. That gets our meaning across. It does so quickly and clearly and leaves more room for us to explain our ideas. So as I was saying about jargon before, jargon is industry or discipline specific terms and language. Jargon can be good in the sense that in some cases it eliminates wordy definitions for some readers. Jargon essentially exists to act as a word or short phrase that means some larger concept. However, you should be mindful of your use of jargon. Use this only when your audience is comprised of industry insiders, people who are part of the discipline or the industry that you are writing to and are guaranteed to understand the terms. You may ask yourself, will my intended audience understand these terms? If you're in doubt, offer definitions or eliminate the piece of jargon altogether. In terms of tone, tone is when word choices reveal an author's attitude or bias toward an idea, topic, group of people, etc. And in academic writing, we aim for an objective tone. In this case, we have a sentence, opponents of this measure are crazy. Well, calling a group of people crazy just because we don't agree with them doesn't really do much for our purposes, right? So instead, we might say those who oppose this measure may not be considering all of the relevant information. What this example does is, first of all, it gets a bit more specific about what we mean by crazy, this word crazy being very subjective and, hard for a reader to understand. And it does kind of lengthen the sentence a little bit. It kind of goes against what I've been saying about conciseness or reducing things. But remember that one thing that may happen in this phase of editing and revising is that we may have to add material. We may have to add words in places to create that clarity of understanding that we're aiming for. In terms of style, we're talking about word choices that indicate the text's level of formality. In academic writing, we are always aiming for a more professional style of language, which means we try to avoid uses of slang or casual language and unnecessary shorthand like you might see in text messages between your friends and family. So in the example here, the kids weren't careful and didn't base their analysis on the data the prof told them to use. Words like kid and contractions like weren't and didn't sort of represent that casual language that we're talking about. Prof kind of exists in that area of slang, meaning professor, right? One way we clarify this sentence is to say the students were careless and did not base their analysis on the data their professor indicated or instructed them to use. And one of the things by substituting student for kids here, first of all, we are being a bit more respectful. As students, you are certainly not children. Most of the students on our campus are over the age of 18, some by many years. So we're creating that level of respect and also that level of formality by not reducing ourselves to this more casual language and this sort of unnecessary shorthand. In terms of inclusivity, APA and MLA style are both in their most recent editions making a bid towards more and more inclusive language. You might already know that they welcome the use of the singular they as a gender neutral pronoun. So in terms of inclusivity, we want to work towards word choices that indicate who authors envision as their audience. In academic writing, we're trying to eliminate uses of the gender neutral he, which is obviously not gender neutral at all, and assumptions of white as the default race of subjects in our writing. So in the first example, every student should bring his book. Well, obviously we know not every student in a class is male. It's entirely possible, but very, very unlikely. So two ways we could rephrase this sentence. All students should bring their books, or every student should bring their book. In this example, 12 children and a Black woman were present. We might change that to 12 boys and a woman were present. The inclusion of race in these sentences race should only be included in these sentences when it's absolutely what am I trying to say here? Oh man, I'm so sorry, I lost my thought there. When it's absolutely relevant to the topic we're talking about. I mean, cases you may be writing about topics that do include specific racial groups or specific gender groups. And in those cases, it's absolutely okay to refer to them because they are the subject of the study. We don't have to sort of like wash color or gender out of our writing, just making sure that it is relevant to the subject as we're discussing it. Okay, so the last part of the process we're going to talk about is proofreading. Proofreading focuses on the minutia, the attention to detail and credibility that we create through cleaning up our writing. We're focusing here on grammar errors, misspellings, formatting issues, our bibliographic entries in our reference pages or works cited pages, punctuation, our consistency in uses of form like bullets, captions, etc., the format of our quotes, the accuracy of our attributions, captions for images and figures in accordance with MLA, APA, Chicago Manual Style, AP Style, and so on. This may involve using some kind of spell or grammar checker, creating a checklist to review your document, revisiting some of your sources to make sure you've got everything correct, and referring back to that style guide that you're using. So some of our goals here are to eliminate all grammatical, spelling, and punctuation errors, making things as clean as possible. We want to maintain consistent formatting choices. So if you say for bullet points, you have your bullet points on one level, all of those bullet points of that level should be formatted in a consistent line going through the whole paper. You want to follow your style guide as closely as possible, looking specifically to trouble areas like block quotations, in-text citations, the use of font styles, font sizes, and where page numbers go. You want to ensure your bibliography includes every work you referenced in the paper. And by doing this, by making a clean, consistent document free of errors, we only increase the audience's trust in us, in our writings, and therefore our ideas. So some questions to ask. Have I run a spell check or grammar check? And is there an app for that? There's a lot of apps out there. The only one for grammar check that I'm familiar with in any way is Grammarly, and I haven't really used that in a very long time. But I'm sure there's got to be more out there. Have I read this paper out loud yet? Have I read it with a friend? Have I taken it to the Writing Center? Have I reviewed each block quotation or other similar quotations for their formatting? Does my paper look correct? This may sound strange, but one thing you can do with lots of pieces of writing is set the page down and step back a little bit. Not too far, but enough that you can just kind of see it as a whole document or as a whole image, essentially. Sometimes little things will just jump out at you as looking out of place. When you see something that looks out of place, investigate it more closely. Do I need a title page for this? Some assignments will require a title page, some won't. Is it clear where each borrowed piece of info is from? And have I consulted a style guide or the Writing Center handouts for formatting help? Some strategies for proofreading. Again, read aloud, but this time try reading from the last sentence to the first, because in this phase, you're not really looking at how the ideas are coming across. You've already done that. Your ideas are impeccable. Everything makes great sense and is in the right order. Now you're just looking for those small errors. So reading from the last sentence to the first will keep you from being distracted by the ideas and you're just looking at the sentences themselves. You might change how the text looks, either in layout, the color, font, or size. Sometimes increasing the size of your writing will help you spot errors a little more clearly, but make sure to change things back after you've proofread and before you've turned the assignment in. Also look for patterns of error in there. Do you see a common issue? Maybe with your use of commas. That's a fairly common one. Put this on a checklist and then get advice from the Writing Center. If you have a checklist of patterns that you've recognized or areas of concern that you have, bring that with you to the Writing Center. That's absolutely something we can use to examine your text. With that checklist in hand, again, make one pass through your paper for each of those concerns on your checklist. And of course, keep your genres conventions in mind. It's very different to write, say, a rhetorical analysis of a Shakespeare play versus writing a scientific paper on water desalination, right? Those are two vastly different genres with two vastly different sets of concerns. So keep those in mind as you're writing. Not everything you write will be identical to the last thing you wrote. And of course, refer to dictionaries and thesauruses. You can use these for ways to find new words, though do try not to just endlessly look for new words to kind of alleviate those feelings of repetition you might have. But use them also to look for definitions of words, or if a word doesn't feel right or doesn't quite fit in the context of a sentence, you can use these things to look for the word that will. So some ways to track your work. Definitely save your work frequently and in multiple places. Personally, I use Dropbox a lot, but I've also been using Google Docs a lot. So I usually have one copy of whatever I'm working on my desktop, but I also have a separate copy in Dropbox. Just in case something happens to my computer, I can always go back to it. Of course, there's so much cloud storage out there, thumb drives, and of course, Rebel files is a thing that you can use. Also date all draft versions and revisions of your work just so that you can keep things sort of clear in your organization, so you know like what's the last thing you worked on, what's the first. You never know when you might get an idea just by looking back at an old piece of work. Create that miscellaneous catch-all document for things that you've discarded, but also for research tidbits that you don't quite know where they fit yet, but you want to get them down, or quick bursts of inspired writing. Sometimes you might think of a line or a cool turn of phrase. Put that down in some miscellaneous document so you have it for later use. Also, if you're working with Word or Google Docs, use the comment function to save yourself little notes. Maybe you don't quite know where you're going with an idea yet, but you can leave a little flag to say, hey, like, elaborate on this later. Related to this, when working in Word, I also like to use the track changes function to show, new writing will show up usually in red on my laptop. Things that I've moved around to other places will show up in green. Things I've deleted will show up on the sidebar where the comments go. And this is just a neat way for me to keep track of changes I've made from one iteration to the next. You might choose to color code sources and themes and create a key for your system. You may highlight in a certain color all the ideas that fit under a particular theme, or all of the source material that comes from a specific quote or a specific source. That way, you just kind of have a track of where all this information is coming from, or how different pieces of information relate to one another. Another great way to track your work is to make a summary and purpose outline of your paragraphs. Essentially, what this does is either in the margin of your paper or on a separate piece of paper, going through each paragraph, you summarize what the paragraph says in a single line, and then what the paragraph does in another single line. And that way you just have eventually this outline of what the paragraph's saying, what it does. And you can update this periodically as you revise your work, and also use it as a way to check if you're accomplishing your purpose. If the paragraph says something, but is supposed to be doing another, or what it's actually doing isn't in line with your purposes, that'll be a good indication that this is a paragraph that you need to retool somehow, move somewhere else, or maybe take out entirely. Okay, so some general tips to kind of end up this, to finish up this presentation. Remember that writing is a process and that it's not always linear. It doesn't always, start and then move steadily towards the end. Sometimes you have to repeat the revision process or the editing process a few times before you get to the final product and the proofreading stage. As I said before, sometimes you find yourself revising or editing small bits as you're still working on in the draft phase. And that's okay. Make the process what it needs to be to fit your needs. Always keep your audience, purpose, and the genre of your writing in mind. Be aware of what your audience needs in order to understand your ideas. Be aware of what it is you're trying to do and how you're either achieving that or maybe straying from that purpose. And then what it is that your genre of writing needs to be a successful version of that piece of writing. Use prompts and models as checklists. If you have access to a particularly successful piece of writing in the genre that you're working on, compare yours to that and see how the two match up. Does that maybe reveal some shortcomings, things that you can shore up in your own writing? Always be on the lookout for your own error patterns. Knowing them is the first step to correcting for them, or at least knowing them well enough to put those in front of a second reader and say, hey, I know I do this. Can we look for this specifically? Reading out loud, as I've said, helps in many ways. Proofreading should always come last. It is the cleanup, the clean sweep before you send this thing out into the world to be whatever it's going to be. Do not forget subject librarians. There are research librarians in the library. You've maybe already heard this, but they are waiting and love to help you. They are absolute nerds in their subject and the best people to talk about that thing. So if there's a subject librarian for the topic you're working on, go bug that person. They will absolutely love to talk to you. And of course, last but not least, please come to the Writing Center. We love to see people. We love to help people. It's our favorite thing. It is the absolute thing that gives us purpose in the world and gets us out of bed in the morning. So please come visit us. So are there any questions, comments, or concerns?
Thanks so much, Tim, for joining us. Hope everyone has a good rest of your day. Thanks for joining us for all our workshops today. We'll see you all tomorrow.
All right. Thank you for joining, everyone. I really enjoyed it.